to Bourbon and BS, the podcast where I dive deep into the world of spirits, one shot at a time. I'm Mike Fody, founder and director of the Bourbon, Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, where my goal is to help you master spirits to guide your future choices. Did you ever feel that the bourbon or whiskey you treasure doesn't seem to give you the same profile it always did? Are you sure you're getting the bourbon, whiskey, or other spirit you think you are? There are plenty of legitimate, non-deceptive reasons why someone might experience a whiskey differently from one tasting to the next. In fact, this is one of the most misunderstood parts of whiskey appreciation. People often jump to, the distillery changed something, when the real explanation is far more human, environmental, or sensory-based. Here are the most meaningful factors. Why a whiskey might taste different without any misrepresentation. Your palate changes day to day. It could change as a result of fatigue, the amount of hydration or dehydration, sleep deprivation, stress, and even what you ate earlier can dramatically shift how you perceive the sweetness, bitterness, oak, and ethanol. Whiskey is extremely sensitive to your physical state. Another factor is really what you ate before. Spicy foods, citrus, coffee, mint, chocolate, and even toothpaste can alter your palate for hours. A whiskey you loved yesterday might seem muted or harsh today simply because your palate is off balance. I once had a taste of a gin that was barrel aged for 4 years. And that taste, that piney taste, the juniper was so strong, it was stuck in my mouth for over a day. There could be glassware differences. The first time you tried it, maybe it was in a Glencairn or a Copita glass. And the next time, a rocks glass or some type of a tumbler funnel glass. So the glass that you use actually can alter your perception of the spirit. The temperature of the spirit can change it. Cooler whiskeys suppress aromas, emphasize oak and bitterness, whereas warmer whiskey opens up a sweetness and esters. A few degrees can make a big change. Oxidation in the bottle. Once opened, oxidation slowly interacts with the whiskey. Over weeks or months, this can soften edges, flatten brightness, and even shift the balance of flavors. It's not spoilage, it's just natural evolution. The bottle fill level. A nearly empty bottle has far more oxygen exposure than a full one. And then there's also batch variation, even when honest and transparent. Small batch or single barrel products naturally vary quite significantly. Even large producers have micro differences between batches due to barrel selection, warehouse location, and blending choices. A couple more factors include the environment around you, environmental aromas. Whiskey tasting is heavily influenced by ambient scents, such as candles, perfumes, colognes, cooking, those kinds of things. Your expectations and mood, they can affect the way you perceive a spirit. I know sometimes if you're in a distillery and you're having fun with friends, that same whiskey will not taste, or you won't have the same experience if you're tasting it at home or somewhere else. So all of these factors can really influence your perception of a spirit. And then finally, whiskey itself, it continues to open up in the glass. So the volatile compounds evaporate, esters bloom, and the profile shifts even over 10 to 30 minutes. So if you tasted it quickly one day and slowly the next day, it will seem like it's a different spirit. But here are some things that producers have been called out on. A class action allegation against Templeton. Templeton Rye marketed its rye as made in Iowa and small batch, while sourcing and distilling outside of the state. The settlement required label clarifications and monetary relief. Elijah Craig changed its line. Heaven Hill removed the 12-year age statement from the Elijah Craig label without really telling people what was going on. It cited inventory pressures, but what it ended up doing is giving the people the impression that it was the exact same 12-year-old when it really wasn't. And the quality of the spirit in the bottle dropped, but the price stayed the same. And another lawsuit was against Tin Cup. They settled a false advertising class action suit over claims it was made in Colorado, agreeing to almost a $500,000 settlement. And there was labeling and marketing changes and refunds that they had to agree to as well. And I'm going to post all the references for this data and information on my blog. So if you're interested in looking at it, you can find it. So the real topic of this podcast and the associated blog that will be on my website is to help you understand some of the challenges with getting the products that are being promised, presented, or represented. I'll provide examples of cases and issues as well as sources of information and things you can do to protect yourself from being misled. The spirits industry has been repeatedly using ambiguous terms, selective disclosures, cosmetic additives, and opaque production claims to boost sales. Recent high-profile legal actions include the Tin Cup case and the settlement associated with it. And there's been multiple class action suits against Diageo over their 100% agave tequila claim, labeling. And it illustrates how labeling, marketing, and production shortcuts can mislead consumers. Now, my guide for selecting a spirit is always to taste it first. If you try it and you like it, does it matter what the label says? Well, that's up to you. But for me, if I'm going to be purchasing a product, I want the product that is presented on the label to be consistent with what I'm paying for. Because a lot of these producers will be charging premium prices for products that really don't deserve that kind of price. A legitimate business will not hide its practices or make changes without notifying its customers. So for me, transparency is the key. If it seems like they're cheating or hiding something and I find out, they'll never see another penny of my money. There are too many good operators and producers, especially a lot of craft distilleries, that produce some great products, as good as the big boys do, and don't charge these exorbitant prices. So this podcast will probably be a bit longer than the ones I usually do, and you can pause it and continue on at your leisure. I'll just give you a couple of those sources of the information. Primary sources include the TTB COLA filings, class action dockets, the IWSR Discus market reports, the Bourbon report. So there's a lot of sources and resources to look up some of the cases that have been filed. Specific sources, again, can be found on my website in the blog where I will post the information I'm giving you now. I think another challenge that's coming on is a current downturn in the spirits industry. It can lead to more practices, if you will, to mislead consumers to purchase cheapened down products or misrepresent items as being whiskey that aren't even close to what you're getting or what they're trying to communicate you're getting. Industry reports show declines in high-end spirits and softer premiumization, increased pressure to stretch aged stocks and rely on marketing narratives. Some patterns, there's more deceptive practices which exploit perception, words, colors, and provenance rather than outright fabrication. Regulators require truth in mandatory elements such as ABV, age if stated, class, distillery location, and bottling information. But marketing language and omissions create gray areas. Again, it's rising probably because of the downturn in the market. There could be aged stock shortage, pushing brands towards non-age statements, sourcing, and marketing that stretch consumer expectations. Legal precedents, again, include the Templeton settlement, the Tin Cup settlement, and the Fireball suit, which was allowed to be filed and claims had to be paid as a result of the Fireball suit. Just to give you some background on this from a historical perspective, U.S. whiskey regulations grew from 19th century chaos. alterations and fraud, things that hurt individuals. And it grew into this formal consumer protection like the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897 and to today's TTB labeling regimen, which is 27 CFR Part 5 and the COLA approvals. These rules created verifiable standards for provenance, age, proof, and label accuracy. But modern practices such as non-age statement, sourcing bourbon, ambiguous craft claims exposing gaps consumers should still watch for when purchasing products. From a historical perspective and why these reforms were needed, pre-1897 market problems occurred. In the late 1800s, widespread adulteration, coloring, flavoring, and dangerous additives made it hard for buyers to trust whiskey sold as aged or straight. Producers and reformers pushed for federal standards to restore confidence in the quality of the product. This is when the Bottle and Bond Act was enacted. It was 1897, and it guaranteed authenticity. The act required spirits to be from one distiller, one distilling season, aged at 4 years, at least 4 years, in a bonded warehouse under federal supervision, and bottled at 100 proof, with the distillery identified on the label. It also provided a tax incentive, deferred excise tied to government supervision. This made the federal government a guarantor of authenticity. The evolution into the modern federal rules occurred soon after. From the Treasury to the TTB, the original bonded warehouse and anti-adulteration principles persisted and were folded into the modern regulatory framework, which is now administered by the Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau, which I call TTB. And the TTB is responsible for enforcing labeling, standards of identity, COLA, which is a certificate of label approval. So the labels have to be approved by the government. And this is under requirements of this law, 27 CFR Part 5. And these rules for labeling define mandatory label elements: brand, class or type, alcohol content, age statements when used, and prohibited or misleading claims cannot be used. Now, the age statements are the same as they are in Europe, for instance, for Scotch, where you have to indicate what is the youngest whiskey if you're using a blend. If it's a single barrel, that's not an issue. But if you're blending or putting multiple barrels of the same group together, then it has to indicate what the age was. And that's easy to do if it's a single barrel, but not so much if it's a blended. You have to keep track of it. So again, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau is part of the U.S. Department of Treasury. It oversees label approvals for COLA standards and standards of identity, advertising rules, formula approvals, and tax compliance for alcohol. Central to your work in evaluating transparency, provenance, and misleading claims in the spirits industry. So this stuff is really helpful. So the first class action suit that I'm going to talk about is the Templeton dossier. It was Templeton Rye, Aliano versus Templeton Rye Spirits, LLC. So what happened was the plaintiffs alleged Templeton marketed the whiskey as made in Iowa and small batch, while the spirit was being distilled in Indiana, most likely MGP, and sourced from third parties. The company agreed to a $2.5 million settlement and label adjustment. It started in 2006. It pretty much ended by 2014. This is when the process was going on. The class action suit was filed in 2014, and then in 2015 the preliminary approval of settlement was made. The legal outcome, as I said, was a $2.5 million property damage filing and prospective labeling changes. Templeton denied any wrongdoing but settled to avoid litigation costs. So how can consumers protect themselves? You have to demand provenance. You have to look for where it's distilled. And on the label, it has to say that, distilled in. In order for them to get a COLA approval for the label, it has to have that specific thing stated on the label. So you need to prefer transparency. If people are accepting of these poor practices, and by accepting I mean you actually go and buy the product, you're supporting the manufacturer, they'll just keep doing this kind of stuff. The next dossier I'm going to talk about is the Elijah Craig situation. It was a Heaven Hill age statement change. What happened was Heaven Hill removed the fixed 12-year age statement from the Elijah Craig bottle, and they indicated small batch in 2016, shifting to an 8 to 12-year range due to inventory pressure, and the company framed it as transparency while preserving the taste profile. It occurred around 2016. They used to sell an Elijah Craig small batch with a 12-year age statement, and that was what the consumer expectation was. What they ended up doing was just pulling the 12-year off of it, and everything else looked the same, but the price didn't change either. And what ended up happening was there was a lawsuit filed against Elijah Craig while Heaven Hill is the parent company, and the lawsuit was found that they did have, the plaintiffs did have a case. So consumer impact and the controversy, removing age statements let producers blend younger barrels into a brand that was formerly marketed on a single age, and it alters the perceived value and the taste expectations. That was the issue that the plaintiffs brought up in this case, and they were correct to do so. But how can consumers protect themselves? You have to prefer explicit age statements or single barrel releases when age matters. Don't fall for gimmicky words like rare, small batch, limited release without finding out what they mean. Watch release notes. Follow brand press releases and independent reviews for formulary changes. I'm not a big fan of independent reviews to make a choice of the whiskey, but a lot of times you can find in magazines like Whiskey Advocates or maybe in somebody else's podcast where they actually report that these changes have occurred. So you can find information about this case on the court docket. Heaven Hill had a press release, the TTB Cola site. How can you protect yourself? Again, watch for distilled in lines, and if you see things that you think are incorrect, then file a complaint. The last case I'll talk about is the Tin Cup case. And basically what happened was Tin Cup was marketed as Colorado made in small batch, and the plaintiffs alleged the spirit was actually distilled and produced in Indiana. So they brought a deceptive labeling class action suit. Tin Cup did settle for $425,000, and they indicated that the process was going on from July of 2013 through September of 2015. And anybody who had purchased the product could get a small settlement. The defendant agreed to revise the labels and marketing as well and to disclose the actual state or states of distillation for 4 years as a result of a truth in advertising. The exact label language is how you protect yourself. You have to locate and check it out. So they were saying it was made in Colorado, but most likely if it was made in Indiana, it was MGP. They're saying small batch. There is no definition of small batch. And they also indicated crafted in Colorado. Back label lines, look at them to verify. So the front labels are usually very flashy. The back label, they have to legally have a distilled in and have the state, or distilled by the company and in. And it usually is in small print, but if the producer is not trying to hide something from the consumer, they do have it available on the label. They have to have it available on the label. So I'll give you an example of what the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 states. There's a requirement that the whiskey in the bottle has to be 4 years old. It has to be bottled at 100 proof by a single distiller, single distillery season. And there are 2 distillery seasons in the United States, January to June and July to December. It has to be under the federal supervision in a bonded warehouse, and it has to have a green bond stamp, which dictates authenticity. The TTB requires an age statement if it's less than 4 years old. So if it's bottled in bond, then you know that it's at least 4 years old, and they don't have to have an age statement. The ABV must be declared. The proof can be put on there. One of those two, either ABV or proof. Most producers put both on. It can't mislead. The label has to indicate exactly what's in the bottle, and the big ones are distilled in or distilled by. The TTB reviews the labels and enforces the standards, but there is no routine sensory testing, so they don't actually check and see what's in the bottle. A COLA approval and explicit labeling claims are required, so consumers should read the small print, typically on the back label. Why are there still gaps and what to watch for? Non-age statements and sourcing. Most brands can omit age statements, which are non-age statements, or source whiskey from third-party distillers. Both are legal but can mislead consumers about maturity and origin. The TTB focuses on label accuracy, not labeling market nuance. So these terms like handcrafted or some people put these indicators on there that they're special in some way, or they're produced in Colorado using special spring water and things like that. Most of that stuff is it's not regulated or controlled by the TTB. And my perspective on it again is, if you try the whiskey and you like it, does it matter that much? It only matters to me if I feel like I'm being misled. So some practical consumer protections again. Read the back label. Look for distilled in, bottled by. Verify COLA entries on the TTB website. And that gives you an idea if what they're saying is actually what they have in the bottle. You could also prefer bottled in bond or explicit age statements on the products that you buy, whether it's straight whiskey or bottled in bond. Again, there's regulatory gaps and enforcement variability, and so you have to watch for these things because they can lead to misleading claims, and plaintiffs often rely on consumer protection statuses and scientific testing. So it's sort of the caveat emptor, which is a French term that means buyer beware. Look for explicit things on the labeling, like no color added. That's another one. Local craft distillers versus the big boys. I do enjoy whiskey from big producers, but I also really love to check out the craft distilleries, because those people, they may make 1 or 2 casks of a specific product. And so people rely on the product that's in the whiskey bottle, but if they start changing things, people notice that very quickly. So now I'm going to give you, it'll be a quick reference table. It's combined table of misleading techniques, legal statuses, examples, and consumer impact. And this will be posted on the blog because I'm not going to go through the entire table. It basically has 5 columns, which the first column is the technique that they use, what it implies or signals, the legal regulatory status or why it misleads, notable examples and cases, and then consumer impact. So the first one I'll indicate is the technique of ambiguous craft language. The producers will indicate craft, handmade, small batch, artisanal, those kinds of things to try to get you to think that the product is very unique in some way. And a lot of these terms don't have a legal definition, and the TTB doesn't regulate it. So if there's no uniform legal definition, it's often treated just as puffery or marketing verbiage, and it's not regulated. Some examples, again, widespread industry practices. I mean, how many times have you seen small batch or craft or handmade on a whiskey label? Suits have targeted brands using artisanal claims. The consumer impact is a lot of times these producers will require a premium price for perceived authenticity when there's nothing authentic about it. So that's just one example. There's a lot of other ones. The non-age statement issue, that also indicates that there's a premium profile without a fixed age statement. And age statements are optional, but if used, they must be truthful. So they don't have to put it on there. In the Elijah Craig case, what they did was they eliminated the 12-year statement, but that also changed the quality of the product that was in the bottle. And because they weren't stating an inaccurate age, there was no legal issue at the time. But then once it went to court, they did end up having a settlement in that case. So the next table that I've produced, and it will be available in the blog, is a comprehensive, actionable list of misleading, ambiguous, or omitted claims used across the spirits industry. What each claim signals, why it can be deceptive, and real-world examples that you can cite and take a look at. Now, interestingly enough, again, this is a pretty large table, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'll talk about the first one. The first technique is the made in X, or where it's made. What it signals is that it's like a local product or a distillery origin. Now, by TTB regulations, that has to be accurate. Why it misleads? It omits third-party distillation or out-of-state production. So again, a lot of producers buy product from MGP, especially craft producers do this when they're starting their business. And as long as their label is accurate about what's in that bottle, that's fine. It's when they don't put what's in the bottle that's a problem. And so you need to check that back label as I indicated. And some of the other things on this chart that, again, is interesting would be the finished in what type of cask, natural color versus no disclosure, bourbon or mash bill. There's a case that was filed against a Canadian firm that indicated that they had a bourbon mash in their product. Well, you can't use the term bourbon in a Canadian product because that's legally only a U.S. Product. Just some other terms to look for: rare, artisan crafted, moonshine, handcrafted, artisanal, old family recipe, master distillers select, frontier whiskey, mountain made, since a specific date like 18 whatever. It refers to the brand, not to the distillery. And so you just have to look for these words that really have no legal meaning. They're just marketing fluff. A couple other things to think about are purity and ingredient claims. Again, the tequila lawsuits brought against Diageo's alleged 100% agave. They were false. The labels were false. And so you want to look at the labels now to be sure that what you're purchasing, especially if it's a premium product, is actually that product. Another area is cosmetic additives and finishing claims. Caramel coloring is widely used in Europe. It's used in Scotch. And it's okay because everybody knows that that's legal to use, and it provides the whiskey with a very consistent color. A lot of people look at the appearance of a spirit in order to determine whether they like it or not. It affects how you perceive the spirit. So here are 10 focus questions to ask at a distillery or retail outlet. But I would caution you, and the whole reason behind this podcast is when you go to retail outlets, a lot of the clerks or the people that you talk to have little or no knowledge of spirits. So be careful. Be sure that they're asking questions, or they are answering questions accurately. What I like to do actually is ask them specific questions that I know the answer about, and if they give me the wrong answer, I'll know that they know little or nothing about the spirits. So some of the questions to ask if you're not into reading the label is, where was the spirit distilled? That gives you a primary provenance claim. You get an idea of what is on the label is what is in the bottle. Where was this spirit aged and bottled? That's another thing. Is the spirit product distilled here or sourced from another distiller, like MGP? Does the bottle carry an age statement, or is it a non-age statement product? I don't have a problem with non-age statement products. I think people just need to understand that that's what you're getting. Is there an age statement, and is the age of the youngest barrel in the age statement? So again, if you're buying a Scotch whiskey, let's say you're buying a single malt Scotch, but they blend a 10-year, a 15, and a 30-year, the age statement cannot say the 30 on it. It has to say the 10. It has to indicate the youngest whiskey or Scotch that's in that blend. The same is true in the United States. Are there any colorings, additives, flavorings, or sweeteners? In the United States, in bourbon, you can't add color, additives, or sweeteners to bourbon. You can do that with other whiskeys, but you have to state it as well. What does finished in X casks mean? And how long were they finished? If you took a whiskey and put it in a cask that had sherry in it and left it in there for a day, they can put that it was finished in that cask, but would it really have an impact on the product that you're getting? So, for instance, one of the scotches that I really enjoy is Glendronach. I like the 12-year-old. And that's aged in two different types of sherry casks. But when you're at the distillery or if you're at a retail outlet, you can ask them about those kinds of things. Is this a single barrel release or a small batch blend, and how many barrels per batch? So, like, you can call it small batch, and you can put that on the label, but to a producer of millions of barrels a year, then a small batch might be, 2,000 barrels. To a craft distillery, a small batch could be as much as a single 30-gallon barrel. So you need to understand what that terminology means. Can you show the TTB Cola approval number and other label approval documentation? I would only dig this deep if you felt like there was something going on. And then, are there any third-party certifications or lab tests for this product? Again, this is a dig deep because now you really believe that something is going on. Was the term approved for use or as a result of a certificate of authenticity by the TTB? So below, I'm going to now talk about consumer protection. It's a focused list of label words and statements that genuinely signal authenticity in whiskey. These aren't marketing buzzwords. They're legally meaningful and enforceable, and those kinds of things will help you determine whether the product is deceptive or not. So some authenticity indicators on whiskey labels include distilled in, straight bourbon, straight rye, straight whiskey. If it says it's straight, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years, no added flavoring or color, and if under 4 years, the age statement is required. It's a reliable indicator of real maturation and no additives. Bottled and bond, we already talked about what that was. It's one distiller, one distilling season, at least 4 years of age, bottled at 100 proof. Distillery and bottling location must be listed on the label. So this is an extremely tough a label to be deceptive with because the requirements are so stringent. So when you buy a bottled and bond product, which I do a lot of the time, you know what you're getting. Other things to look for are, again, this explicit age statements, no color or caramel coloring or no additives, single barrel, when it says single barrel, the whiskey in that bottle had to come from one individual barrel. It's not a guarantee of quality, but a guarantee of non-blended origin. Look for the barrel number or the warehouse location for added legitimacy. The cask strength or barrel proof is another one. This indicates the whiskey was bottled at the proof it came out of the barrel. So there could be minimal filtration. If you ever go to a distillery and you watch them empty the casks, charred casks end up leaving some charcoal. It comes off the barrel during the maturation process, and you don't want that charcoal floating around in your whiskey. So they do filter it through some type of a filter. So that can be done without changing the ABV. A few more terms include distilled by, not produced by, distilled by. It's a legally meaningful term, and produced by, crafted by, made by, inspired by, those things are often hiding the sourcing. Authentic labels proudly name the actual distillery. Geographic certification, Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, and the NOM for tequila. These are legally protected terms tied to strict production rules. For Scotch, it must be distilled and aged in Scotland for a minimum of 3 years, and typically in a cask of 700 liters or less. For Irish whiskey, it's the same thing. It's got to be still distilled and aged in Ireland for 3 years. For tequila, the NOM number identifies the exact distillery where it was produced. Another thing I like to have on the label is the mash bill. And a lot of bourbon producers in the United States or whiskey producers do not include the mash bill. Why I like it is because I prefer a wheated whiskey, and I can always tell if it's not a high wheat. When you say high wheat or high rye, those terms don't have a legal definition, but it's typically assumed to be 20% of the mash bill is that flavoring grain, wheat or rye, whatever it happens to be. So I do like to see the mash bill on the label. It really helps confirm the whiskey, and it aligns with the category rules. For instance, bourbon, has to be at least greater than or equal to 51% corn. But the distillery that I do tours and tastings at, ours is 59% corn. But we do make a couple of high wheats, which are in the 30% range, and then the rest of it is malted barley. I just like to see it. And a lot of producers will tell you what it is. If you go to the distillery, they just don't put it on the label, and it's not required. So a practical tip is to record the answers that you get to these questions. You can even take pictures of bottles and labels and statements that are written on the labels. I actually like to do that if I'm considering a new product that I can't get a taste of. I look for local retail outlets in New York State. They do tasting activities. So the producers, the large producers or the local craft producers will come in and run tastings for some of their products. And I enjoy going to those things. It helps me determine whether I want to purchase the product or not. And then you can ask a lot of questions. Now, sometimes the people that are doing these tastings don't know the answers any better than the knowledgeable people in the retail outlets. Another term that appears a lot on whiskey labels now are chill filtration. What's chill filtration? What the producer does is that they reduce the temperature of the whiskey down to about 0 degrees centigrade. And when they do that, they then run it through a filter. What that does is it removes certain compounds that will cause the whiskey to get cloudy if you add ice to it. I drink my whiskey neat, but a lot of people like to put a cube of ice in it. When you do that, my recommendation is to have them put one large piece of ice, like one large square or one large circle. The reason is because that will not melt as quickly, so the influence on the profile of the whiskey due to the ice will be diminished, but you can still cool the whiskey, especially if it happens to be a high ABV. So that's something else that you can look for. Purists believe that doing that, the chill filtration, it changes the whiskey profile because you're removing chemicals from the product and congeners, lipids, those kinds of things. And so they're probably right if you're sensitive to that. If it doesn't bother you, if you don't mind it, I don't have a problem with chill filtration. I just think that it should be put on the label if they're doing it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is things that producers do, and I'm going to put this in quotes, cheats for maturation. It's not cheating, but it's a way that they can engage in activities that make the whiskey seem like it's older than it is. So distilleries use a range of techniques to, quote, speed up, simulate, or intensify maturation. But each shortcut trades time, which you need for maturation, for getting it out and allowing a true oxidative process to be going along. And remember, that oxidative process is not going to occur unless the whiskey or the spirit's been in a cask for a number of years. Why is that? That's because you need the heat and cooling cycles to push the whiskey into the wood and pull it out. It's when the whiskey's in the wood, it starts picking up some of the vanillin, the caramels, the sugars that have been produced during toasting and charring, and those will come back into the cask. You'll lose the angel's share in some of the volume that goes into the wood, or the devil's cut. Oxygen comes into the cask and causes oxidative processes and other processes that go on in the maturation process. What are some of the things that they can do? They can use small barrels. There's a larger exposure of the whiskey to the wood in a small barrel. So they might use as small as 5 up to 30-gallon casks instead of, say, an American standard barrel, which is a 53-gallon cask. So basically it increases the surface area to volume ratio and accelerates oak extraction, but it doesn't accelerate maturation. So what happens is that the spirit can come over as being over oaked or very one-dimensional if it's left in there too long. There's also wood additives like staves, chips, spirals, and blocks. The distillers actually add toasted or charred wood pieces directly into tanks or barrels, and that speeds up the extraction of lignin, vanillin, and caramelized sugars. It can create the appearance of age in weeks or months, but it's not the same as the slow oxidative reactions that occur in a cask. Sometimes they'll use heat cycling or temperature manipulation in the warehouses. Normally warehouses heat and cool with the seasons, but if you're doing it intentionally by regulating the temperature in the warehouse, you're manipulating this movement of the whiskey in and out of the wood, and it's not occurring over a longer period of time like it would in normal maturation. It's used historically and still practiced in some large Kentucky distilleries. Another practice is using pressure or vacuums or ultrasonic treatments. Some producers use these things to push spirit into the wood more aggressively. It accelerates extraction dramatically, but and it can produce a different finish in the whiskey. It's very controversial. Many traditional distillers reject this as gimmicks. There is also light, sound, or vibration-based acceleration. A few experimental procedures use sound waves or light exposure to agitate the spirit and to push it into the wood. The claims vary widely, and the scientific validation is extremely limited. It falls into the area of experimental technology. I think that any of these procedures are fine, again, if there's transparency on the label so you know what you're getting. There's also artificial warehouse environments, and I mentioned the heat and the cooling and the pressure, but sometimes they manipulate the humidity, the airflow to speed up evaporation and concentration. Warm, more humid environments accelerate oak extraction and oxidation. Some distillers rotate barrels through different warehouse zones to simulate years of aging. Some producers, like Maker's Mark, does that. But everybody knows they do that, so it's not like they're doing it and hiding it. I think a practice that's going to be extremely common, and it has always been done, is blending young whiskey with older stock. And the reason is because they're running out of older stock. So like in the Elijah Craig example, they didn't have enough 12-year-old to continue selling it as 12-year-old, so they started blending it with 8-year-old. And some small distilleries probably don't even have 8-year-old whiskey. It's a legal and common practice, but you need to indicate to the purchaser that that's what they're doing. It's not technically a shortcut, but it's a strategic way to stretch limited age inventory. Some producers have additives. They call it molecular whiskey. A few companies bypass barrels entirely. They add lab-derived flavor compounds to neutral spirits to mimic aged whiskey. It's not considered traditional whiskey by most of the industry, and they should indicate what they're doing on the label. So the shortcuts exist, particularly when a lot of the small craft distilleries are opening up because they need to generate revenue. Now, what a lot of these producers will do is they'll either purchase vodka from a source like MGP or a local distiller, or they'll they'll bottle it themselves, or they'll have them bottle it and label it. And that's not a problem as long as they're transparent about it. But that's how they generate revenue. And they also do the same thing with gin sometimes. They'll buy the vodka, they'll put the vodka in a spirit still, and then they'll add the flavoring components that they use to make their gin, and they'll steep it or use whatever process they actually use to extract the flavors into the vodka to make their gin. It has to be at least juniper and other additives. So what the shortcuts can't replicate is this oxidative maturation that goes on over years. It can't replicate esterification, which is the formation of the fruity and floral esters over time. It can't help with concentration through evaporation. So the angel's share and the devil's cut do play a role in the final profile of the whiskey. And if the product is in a cask for 2 months or 3 months or whatever, you're not going to get that kind of thing going on. And it also doesn't allow for the integration of flavors that occur over long term. Many times the good practices would include taking the whiskey from many barrels, many casks, putting it in a tank so that the aromas and congeners blend together, then putting them into casks and letting them sit in the casks for a period of time so that it all blends together and you get a nice consistent product. The other thing that's going on and is very popular these days, and there's nothing illegal about it, you just need to understand that this stuff is going on, and I like a lot of these products, is the finishing and the secondary maturation. These folks use their own sets of processes to impart like a sherry or a port or a chardonnay or a chartreuse or whatever it is, whatever product they're secondarily maturing or finishing their whiskey in. And there's nothing bad about that, but they have to be accurate about what they've done. A great example of this is you can have a whiskey that has additives. If it's called whiskey, that's fine. You can't have a whiskey that's called straight whiskey and have additives in the United States. That's not legal. You can't call a bourbon that you finished in a port cask, for example, a straight bourbon whiskey. It's not a straight bourbon whiskey once you mature it in a different type of cask. Now you can call it a straight bourbon whiskey secondarily finished or finished in a port cask. That's legal because it's transparent. In this whole area of finishing and secondary maturation, people do use shortcuts. So, for instance, I indicated I like Glendronach. The 12-year-old is a very enjoyable, reasonably priced whiskey, Scotch, single malt Scotch whiskey, and it's matured in Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez casks. But the entire maturation process occurs in those casks. What a lot of producers do is take shortcuts by adding staves, spirals, chips, and blocks into a cask and leaving it there. Why it's a shortcut is because it provides massive surface area with these small pieces of wood or whatever they're using, which gives you rapid extraction. And the process goes on for only weeks instead of months or years, and it can mimic sherry or port or rum or toasted finishes. But the limitations are extraction without integration. It lacks oxidative development and often produces what I'll call, in quotes, loud but shallow finishing notes. Another shortcut is using seasoned or wet casks that aren't truly seasoned. Some finishing casks are generally not seasoned by long-term use in the wine, rum, or sherry production industries. Instead, what they are is they're rinsed with wine or fortified wine. They're rehydrated with a few liters of liquid, and they can be painted or coated internally with residual wine or syrup. It's a shortcut because it creates an instant finishing impact, but avoids the cost of authentic long-seasoned casks. And the downside is that it can taste artificial or overly sweet, and it lacks the depth of real cask maturation. Similar processes, which I mentioned before, are pressure, vacuum, or ultrasonic finishing, heat cycling during finishing. Those things all have the same types of issues as where they don't have an oxidative process going on and that long maturation, which causes additive, subtractive, and integration of the congeners in the spirit. Now, I mentioned wet casks, and one of the things about the casks, if you ever go to a distillery, they purchase these casks, and a lot of times there can be a significant amount of sherry or port or whatever in that cask. Now, they have to have some. The cask has to be wet, because if it dries out and they start putting whiskey in it, it'll leak, and sometimes it can't be fixed. But if you put 4 or 5 gallons of that product in that cask to do something more than just keep it wet, that basically is a sherry additive, and that's not what you're looking for. You want real maturation to be occurring. Another thing that producers do is they will blend finished whiskey into unfinished whiskey, and so what ends up happening is the small portion adds some flavor and aroma congeners, but it saves time and cask resources, but it creates the impression of a full finish. And again, you're just not getting that true full batch finish. Some of them use extractions, essences, wine concentrations, or concentrates. Again, they do that with sherry, they do it with wine, they do it with rum. And again, it's another shortcut. There's zero maturation required when they do this, but it has a huge impact on the flavor. It's not considered legitimate finishing by most of the industry, and it's often banned in stricter whiskey regulations. Like, you can't do that with a bottled in bond or a straight whiskey. Or if you do it with a straight whiskey, you have to specifically indicate what you did on the label. Shortcuts can't replicate, again, the oxidative integration, the esterification, the barrel-to-barrel nuance, the layering effect of long-term secondary maturation. And so what ends up happening is the spirit is sweet but simple. It's not a complex. I recently tasted Port Soy produced. It's a single malt Scotch whiskey produced by Glenglassaugh. And what I was fascinated by is the fact that this is a peated whiskey, and I'm not a big peated whiskey fan. It's just not my taste, or I don't like that experience. But it was very mildly peated, and what happened is as the peat nuance moved through my tasting experience, I started picking up notes of citrus and other things in it. So there was a level of complexity to that spirit that I really enjoyed. You're not going to get that when people are taking these kinds of shortcuts, because there's just not enough maturation time, whether it's in the original cask that it's maturing in or if it's being finished in a secondary cask. So again, how do you find out what cases have occurred, or if you're believing that there's an issue, where do you go to find out this information? There's a lot of different sources. You can go to the TTB. You can look at the sourcing, the labeling information that I indicated. I'm going to put this information on my blog so you can see some of the information that I talked about during this podcast. I think the other thing you can do is you can look at court docket, settlement, PDFs. All that stuff is out on the internet. And actually, a lot of times I'll use ChatGPT or artificial intelligence to have it help me find this information. So now I'm going to give you a local example, an example I just recently ran into. And it's up to you to decide whether there's questionable marketing. I want you to be the judge in this example. And maybe you can look it up yourself when you go to a retail outlet. But I was recently at a retail outlet here in the Buffalo market. And I'm always looking for a bargain. And the bargain that I identified was a single malt American whiskey. Now, for those of you who don't know, I think it'll be 2 years ago in this December, maybe 3 years, I forget. The TTB did actually identify a specific criteria for a single malt American whiskey. And it's different than single malt Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey because there they typically mature in a used bourbon or sherry cask. But in the U.S., what a lot of the producers are doing is making single malt whiskey, and the spirit then is aged in a new charred oak cask. So it's more like, the maturation is more like a bourbon, but the grain is 100% malted barley. So what's it like? And I'm interested in experiencing these spirits. So I was in a local retail outlet, and there was a company called Yellowstone that's on the label. And it says since 1872, and again, I'll post this on my blog. And it says 7th generation family distillery. And I looked at it and I thought, 7th generation? Is there really a producer that's a 7th generation? Because I question these things now, and I look at the back of the label and stuff like that, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck is going on, right? So I start doing research, and I wondered, is 7 generations of Yellowstone distillers accurate? Is that an accurate statement? So there is a direct 7-generation lineage of distillers in the Beam-Dant family, but it's not a continuous, unbroken line of people distilling whiskey every generation without interruption. 7 generation actually means it refers to family lineage, not continuous practice. All right, is that a problem? It's only a problem for me because it seems to be not transparent. I'm still interested in tasting the whiskey, but I don't like the label. So the Beam and Dant families each have long distilling histories. When you trace Stephen Beam's ancestry, you can count 7 generations of ancestors who were involved in distilling at some point in their life. But what this doesn't mean is that each generation distilled professionally, that each generation operated a distillery, each generation passed down an active distilling business. The Yellowstone brand was connected to them across those generations. And so the things that would be misleading or maybe not true, yes, Stephen Beam is legitimately a 7th generation descendant of distillers. His lineage includes Jacob Beam from the 1800s, Joseph Washington Dant from the mid-1800s, and both generations, multiple generations in both families were involved in distilling. What's not true is this whole idea that my father distilled, his father distilled, his father distilled, all the way back 7 generations. The impression that consumers get and that I got when I looked at it is very fuzzy. There were gaps. Generations where distilling wasn't the primary occupation, changes in ownership, prohibition disruptions, and brand transfers unrelated to the family. So the 7 generations claim is heritage, not continuity. And does that matter? I actually haven't tasted the product yet. I bought 2 bottles because it was $25 discount on the bottle, which I hope doesn't mean it doesn't taste very good. But at the end of the day, I want the label to be transparent. Another thing that occurs is this whole contract distillation, primarily MGP and Ross and Squibb. And it comes from contract partners. And a significant portion of Yellowstone's core bourbon is sourced from MGP ingredients. Is that part of this single malt American whiskey? I don't know. Doesn't tell me, right? This includes maturing barrels used for Yellowstone Select, Yellowstone hand-picked barrels, and components of Yellowstone's limited edition releases. So because I don't know and I don't understand that stuff, it bothers me. Should it bother me? I don't know. When I get a bottle of whiskey, especially I'm going to be using it for a tasting activity because it is a single malt American whiskey, I want to know what its lineage is. I want to feel like the producer is being truthful in the way it's marketing. And I was a marketer for a number of years in the pharmaceutical industry. And, you have to be accurate in what you're telling people. I don't like feeling like I'm being led down the primrose path, as it were. So that's my case. I think you should try it. I think you should go and look at the whiskey, decide for yourself, do I like it, do I not, and does this sort of marketing nuance, if you will, bother you? It bothers me, but, that's a personal thing. So the last thing I'll mention is I have developed a retail authenticity checklist, and this will as well be on my blog. And it's got the 10 questions that I mentioned before. Where was the spirit distilled? Why? Because you want to know. Was the spirit aged? Where? Who bottled it? Was the distillery in this state, or was it located, in another state? Does the bottle carry an age statement, or is it a non-age statement? These things are all indicators of provenance, where the product comes from, and if it is what they say it is on the label. Well, thanks for joining me on this whiskey very deep dive. I am a big fan of knowing what I'm drinking, knowing what I'm buying, and paying. I buy premium whiskeys, but I want to know that it is a premium whiskey. So whether as a beginner discovering new flavors or an aficionado pursuing perfection, the journey has always another fascinating glass to offer. If you live in the area, please join me at the Buffalo Distilling Company for a deluxe tour and tasting, or even a full-day whiskey workshop by signing up on my website, bisonbourbonandspiritstc.com, or you can actually sign up for the tour, the deluxe tour, on the Buffalo Distilling Company's website as well. This podcast provides general information and entertainment. Always drink responsibly and consult local regulations before imbibing. This podcast is meant for listeners who are of legal drinking age. I'll be back the next time with another deep dive. Until then, check out the blog, explore the merchandise on my website, and join me for a workshop or tasting at the Buffalo Distilling Company. Until the next podcast, keep sipping, keep exploring, and remember, good whiskey is like a well-crafted story. So do you love bourbon and BS? Bold spirits? Tell a friend. I'm trying to build this podcast the old-fashioned way. One honest pour and one honest listener at a time. Read those labels. Cheers to bold spirits and curious minds.